Welcome everyone to another edition of the Classic Comic Archive, a series where I recap and review many of Marvel Comics' most seminal early issues. Our story for today is The Amazing Spider-Man issue 2 from May of 1963. This issue marks the first appearances of longtime Spider-Man villains the Vulture and the Tinkerer. As with many of Marvel's early comics, this issue is split into two independent stories featuring Spider-Man. The first story was scripted by Stan Lee, drawn by Steve Ditko, and lettered by John Duffy. Our issue begins with a peculiar sight of an elderly man in a green bird costume, who seemingly appears from the sky itself, to brazenly steal a businessman's suitcase on the streets of New York City. It's established that this menace is known as the Vulture, and he has been terrorizing the citizens of New York for some time. His evil deeds have garnered him notoriety throughout the city, yet he remains a decidedly mysterious figure. We see that J. Jonah Jameson, the publisher of the Daily Bugle newspaper, is desperate to capitalize on the Vulture's infamy, but only finds frustration as the high-flying villain never remains in one place long enough to be photographed. Also enthralled by the Vulture's mystique are the classmates of Peter Parker. As established in the last issue, Peter is desperate for cash to support his elderly guardian Aunt May. With how aloof the Vulture is, Peter's classmates speculate that a photo of the villain would be worth a fortune. Peter overhears his classmates and wonders if he can be the one to capture the much sought-out photograph. After being heckled by his classmate Flash Thompson for actually caring about their science assignment, Peter concludes that as Spider-Man, he could get close enough to the Vulture to take his photograph, then sell the picture, and ultimately ease his aunt's financial woes. To this end, Peter borrows a miniature camera that once belonged to his Uncle Ben and suits up as Spider-Man to enact his plan. The issue then shifts focus to the Vulture himself, who we see is plotting to steal a large cache of diamonds that is scheduled to be transported within the city. The Vulture wastes no further time in planning, as we immediately see him leave a secret hideout and head towards the city. With his incredible flying harness, the Vulture arrives in no time and happens to fly right past Spider-Man, who had been waiting for him with his camera ready. The villain fails to notice Spider-Man's presence and continues with his plot. Surprisingly, the Vulture does not head straight for the diamonds. Instead, he flies to the skyscraper offices of the Daily Bugle, the city radio network, and the police department, where he arrogantly leaves behind taunting messages that alert them to his plot. Despite this, the police decide to continue with the diamonds transport as planned, as they don't want the public to think they're intimidated by the Vulture. Confident that his plan will succeed, the Vulture pauses a moment to relish in his seeming triumph. Unknown to the villain, however, Spider-Man had been stealthily following him this whole time. Spider-Man takes the Vulture's stillness as an opportunity to get closer for a better photo, but in his hasty approach, he accidentally rustles a loose brick and alerts the Vulture to his presence. Unaware that he has been caught, Spider-Man briefly distracts himself as he adjusts his camera. In a twist of irony, this brief moment of stillness gives the Vulture his own opportunity to fly high above Spider-Man and ambush him with a powerful kick to the back of his head. The surprise strike dazes Spider-Man long enough for the Vulture to dump his limp body into a nearby rooftop water tower and escape. The shock of the cold water jolts Spider-Man back to full alertness, but the hero finds himself seemingly trapped as he has run out of web fluid and the inside of the tower is too wet and slimy for him to crawl up. Fortunately, Spider-Man realizes that he has another trick up his sleeve, his super strength, as he easily leaps out of the tower. Recovering his camera and returning home, Peter Parker is able to develop its photos, as he had luckily dropped the camera before being plunged into the water tower. While he's glad to have the photos in hand, Peter is troubled by his defeat at the hands of the Vulture. Thankfully, Peter is a gifted inventor, as he begins improving his suit and devising a way to overcome his foe. Several hours later, we see that Peter has finished working on a device that he hopes can bring down the Vulture. But without knowing the villain's whereabouts, Peter can only hope that he'll encounter the Vulture before he can terrorize the city again. In the meantime, Peter travels to the offices of the Daily Bugle, where he's decided to sell his photographs of the Vulture. J. Jonah Jameson personally inspects the photographs and is delighted. The shrewd publisher tries to goad Peter into revealing how he got them, but the wise teenager refuses and requests to be credited anonymously. Jameson agrees and pays Peter accordingly, but not before asking that Peter capture photos of Spider-Man next. The next day, Peter is pressured into joining a few of his classmates as they watch the transit of the diamonds the Vulture has sworn to steal. His classmates hope to catch a glimpse of the Vulture, but Peter himself doubts the villain will appear thanks to the event's heightened police presence. Despite his doubts, Peter still decides to slip away and suit up as Spider-Man just in case. Yet Peter's exit does not go unnoticed, and he is once again heckled by a classmate who calls him chicken. While Peter is away changing into his costume, we see an armored car carrying the diamonds arrive. A man exits the car with the diamonds in tow and is immediately surrounded by an escort of armed policemen. With the policeman's gazes focused squarely on the sky, Vulture suddenly appears from underneath a manhole cover, steals the diamonds, and escapes back into the sewers. Traveling through New York City's elaborate network of underground tunnels, the Vulture is able to re-emerge on the surface through a subway entrance, far away from where he stole the diamonds. The public commotion of the brazen theft reaches the ears of a stunned Peter Parker as he finishes changing into his costume and sets out to stop the daring villain. As Spider-Man, Peter Parker crawls atop a nearby skyscraper and uses his spider sense to locate the Vulture. Yet oddly, the Vulture flies by Spider-Man before he even has a chance to leave the building. How this is possible considering the distance Vulture was touted to have flown away is beyond me. In any case, Spider-Man begins to pursue the Vulture by web swinging across buildings, but the Vulture realizes he's being followed. The villain attempts to pull the same aerial ambush as he had in their first encounter, but Spider-Man senses the attack coming and dodges away. Nonetheless, the Vulture is still able to knock Spider-Man off the rooftop he was standing on, but the hero quickly webs onto the fleeing Vulture. As a seeming parallel to the rescue of John Jameson in the last issue, Spider-Man is able to pull himself up to the Vulture and implant the device he had crafted earlier. The miniature gadget works as planned, as Vulture suddenly finds himself unable to fly and spiraling towards the ground. It's at this moment that Spider-Man reveals that the device he had earlier crafted was an anti-magnetic inverter, as he had cleverly deduced that the key to Vulture's silent flight was harnessed magnetism. The next day, Peter Parker returns to the Daily Bugle and sells his newest photographs to J. Jonah Jameson. The Bugle evidently pays well, as Peter returns home and pledges to pay off Aunt May's rent for an entire year. The first half of this issue subsequently ends, as we see Aunt May and Peter gleefully celebrate their newfound fortune, while the Vulture swears revenge on Spider-Man in a lonely prison cell. Why the Vulture was allowed to wear his strength-altering suit in prison is once again beyond me. The second story in this issue was scripted by Stan Lee, drawn by Steve Ditko, and lettered by Art Simek. This splash page gives us our first look at the second villain of the story, the terrible Tinkerer, and the upcoming battle between him and Spider-Man. But before we get ahead of ourselves, we have to return to the start. Our story begins with Peter Parker carefully conducting a laboratory science experiment at school. Yet Peter's work is interrupted as his teacher introduces him to Professor Cobwell, the most renowned electronics expert in New York City. Peter's teacher congratulates the brilliant student as he has been offered a chance to work as Professor Cobwell's lab assistant for the weekend. Peter is honored to assist the much-lauded scientist and happily accepts. In a hurry, Professor Cobwell quickly thanks Peter, hands him an address card, and asks the young student to pick up a radio for him on the way to his laboratory. Peter's meathead classmate Flash Thompson heckles Peter for being a teacher's pet, but the much beleaguered nerd, perhaps riding on a high of confidence, actually sticks up for himself. Yet Peter doesn't give Flash an opportunity to retort, as the eager young scientist rushes home to get ready to help Professor Cobwell. Being cautious, Peter wears his Spider-Man costume underneath his street clothes and heads to a repair shop to pick up Professor Cobwell's radio. Peter enters the repair shop and is greeted by a mysterious old man who calls himself the Tinkerer. Peter requests Professor Cobwell's radio from the repairman, and the Tinkerer heads into a back room to retrieve it. While the Tinkerer is away, Peter senses strange electric impulses emanating from the old man's equipment. Peter disregards the sensation as his spider sense overreacting, but the inquisitive student has a right to be suspicious, as we see the Tinkerer retrieve the radio from a strange green alien. The alien brags about a special device that he has secretly inserted into the radio, one of seemingly many that the Tinkerer and his otherworldly associates have clandestinely implanted. Having quelled his suspicions, Peter accepts the tampered-with radio from the Tinkerer and heads to Professor Cobwell's laboratory. Peter does however note that the Tinkerer's repair charge is suspiciously low. Back at the laboratory, Peter tries to focus on his work with Professor Cobwell, but can't help but question the odd nature of his visit to the tinkerer's shop. Peter's suspicion peaks as he senses the same strange electric impulses from within the tinkerer's shop at the laboratory. With Professor Cobwell needing to step out for a few hours, Peter takes the scientist's absence as an opportunity to investigate the radio. Opening up the device, Peter discovers strange inner workings uncharacteristic of normal radios. This is just the proof Peter needs, as he suits up as Spider-Man and leaves to learn the truth behind the Tinkerer. Spider-Man is able to enter the Tinkerer's shop through a rooftop opening, where inside he once again senses the strange electric impulses. Honing in on the source of the impulses, Spider-Man discovers a complex workroom hidden underneath the repair shop. There the Tinkerer reveals that he has been using his repair shop as a cover to implant secret listening devices in the radios of important people, presumably so that his alien cohorts can learn military and scientific secrets in preparation for an invasion. Before Spider-Man learns any more, he is spotted by an alien and blasted at with a ray gun. Spider-Man is able to dodge the gun's blast, but the commotion of the attack alerts the other aliens to Spider-Man's presence, and they join in on the fight. Spider-Man is largely able to dodge and evade the aliens' attacks for a time, but is brought to a halt when he is tackled by 3 aliens. While the superhumanly strong hero is able to shake off his foes, this moment of stillness grants the Tinkerer an opportunity to blast Spider-Man from behind, a blow that stuns him long enough to be trapped within an unbreakable glass cage. The aliens decide that Spider-Man must be destroyed lest their plot be exposed, so they begin draining the air from within Spider-Man's cage to suffocate him. Thinking quickly, Spider-Man realizes that the air in his cage is being drawn out through tiny holes. Holes that are just big enough for his webbing to pass through. Aiming at a nearby control panel, Spider-Man launches a web and activates a switch that releases him from his cage. Free from his bonds, Spider-Man lands a powerful punch on one of the aliens, who in turn knocks into another alien who accidentally lights aflame the workroom's master control panel. With the key to their invasion destroyed, the invading aliens flee in a panic. The elderly Tinkerer isn't as quick, however, as Spider-Man is able to intercept him before he can escape. Yet the electrical fire of the master control panel has spread to the entire building. Searing smoke quickly envelops Spider-Man and the Tinkerer, forcing the hero to let go of his foe and flee the burning building. While it seems that all of the aliens manage to escape the fire unscathed, we see that Spider-Man's intervention has forced them to abandon their invasion plan, now that they have lost the element of surprise. But back at the laboratory in his civilian guise, Peter Parker is greeted with the return of Professor Cobwell. The professor excitedly tells Peter that he had seen an alien spaceship leaving Earth as he was returning to the laboratory, although admits it was probably just his imagination. Peter pretends like he's skeptical of the professor's claim, but secretly knows what he saw was real. The issue subsequently ends as we see Peter pull out a mask of the Tinkerer's face, seemingly confirming that the old repairman was an alien himself. That concludes Amazing Spider-Man issue 2, and another episode of the Classic Comic Archive. But before I go, I would like to offer a brief review of this issue. Overall, I thought that this was another solid story from Marvel, but left a little to be desired. While the Vulture's scheme was exciting, I never felt that he was as dangerous a menace as the story would imply. To be frank, an elderly man in an oddly colored bird costume whose only major power is flight does not seem like that much of a threat, especially considering that he made no attempt to protect his identity, or even his own head. As well, there were a few plot inconsistencies and lapses in logic during the first half of the issue that took me out of the story, such as when the Vulture flew past Spider-Man, despite having been shown to be miles away from the hero in the preceding panel, or when Vulture was wearing his costume while in prison. Despite how nitpicky I may be with the first half of this issue, I have to admit that I really enjoyed the goofy nature of the second story. The Tinkerer and his alien goons represent some of the nonsensical fun that draws me to these early stories especially. I also want to mention that in my review of the last issue, I noted how odd I thought Spider-Man's tracking power was, and how I couldn't recall seeing it elsewhere. Well, it only took me one issue to be proven wrong, so I guess my next question is, when did that power stop being regularly used? In any case, let me know what you thought of this issue and the video, and feel free to suggest other classic comics for me to cover. Thanks for watching.